A little bit more about the reopening story in China. Obviously, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of hype and optimism around just how much is this benefiting the luxury sector. How big can this market really be, and how do you compare it to pre-COVID times?
I think that we will see a quite significant increase of the luxury market in China over the next couple of years for several reasons. A, what you already said, we have a very young audience that is coming to the market. It's one of the youngest audiences for luxury if you compare this with other markets. And then also there's an increased wealth in the country. So I'm very convinced that the strong growth that the Chinese sector has seen is going to continue.
Right. So Daniel, what are you hearing now from your clients? Because at least based on the economists that we've talked to, there is spending going on. We're trying to figure out whether these are the one-offs after the reopening of the economy. Is there some sense that this is more sustained?
No, I'm convinced that it is sustained. You have still a little bit of different impacts on different regions, in different areas of spending, but overall, I'm convinced it's going to be sustained. If we take a step back and not just look at the now, but if we look at the development over the last 25 years, the luxury sector has by far outpaced all other sectors, and I don't see a reason why this would change now going forward. So in my opinion, and also discussing with brands in this space, we are not going to see just a one-off, but we are seeing a sustained growth.
Daniel, what do you actually do, and how does China and your advice to Chinese corporates, and give us a sense of the ones that are from the West who are operating in China, how do you advise them differently to elsewhere?
So to summarize a little bit what I'm doing, so I run a brand strategy firm called Equité, and we advise brands all over the world in the luxury sector. And I'm also a professor at Pepperdine University for luxury, and I'm building there a center for disruptive luxury. So our view always on luxury is to try to understand what are really the emerging topics and the emerging trends. And especially what is, to me, is very different when you look at the Chinese market compared with the rest of the world, is one of the things that you mentioned before, is the age group and the age bracket. The average age of Chinese luxury consumption is dramatically younger than in the rest of the world, and this means the share of Gen Z that is already driving China, the purchase in China is much higher than in other markets. And that, of course, has profound implications because Gen Zs are very different in their view of the world. And if you look overall, Chinese Gen Zs versus the rest of the world, you have a very, very strong focus on values like hard working and so on, but at the same time also a very optimistic outlook of the world that makes them also willing and wanting to spend more money.
And it seems like the industry is very bullish, like you, Daniel, that this is going to be one of the biggest luxury markets in the next few years. I think PwC would say it could surpass what we're seeing in Europe and the U.S. as well. Is there still any risk to that, of really, brands really just banking on just one market here? Is there too much reliance in some ways on the China market?
So I always advise my clients to not be dependent only on one region, but to build a global portfolio. Because also there can be always shifts in consumer behavior and patterns that can also impact their preference for brands. So for example, if you take the Chinese market, we see overall a tendency towards buying more local brands than ever before. For me, for example, one of the sectors that I find fascinating is the automotive sector, because as you all know, cars are so much connected with their own self-image and with their own personal brand image, so to speak. And our research now indicates that the preference of Chinese Gen Z towards local brands, especially when it comes to electrified cars, is increasing quite dramatically and is almost on par with the preference towards Western brands. So we see a first sector where you have a shift from a dominance of international brands towards an acceptance of local brands almost at the same level. And if you basically now take this to the future, there could be even a stronger preference towards local brands. And if it happens in automotive, it can happen in all categories. And this is in part why brands always should be very concerned of building really global portfolios and not just thinking of one market and become over-reliant on one market.
Daniel, are there any specific categories that stand out to you then as, perhaps the next one outside of electric vehicles where this preference for local might start to evolve?
I think that you see this across the board. You see this in jewelry, in fine jewelry. You see this in apparel. The race, for example, of the Ant brand versus Nike and Adidas in the Chinese market has been quite impressive. And you see this in luxury beauty too. And so in a lot of these categories, you see more and more brands that are local brands that are not necessarily have always a long history, but are built by people who understand very much the cultural discourse. And this is, of course, extremely critical because Gen Zs are very much focused and very much influenced by what is happening culturally around them. And the better a brand can understand that, the better the brand is able to react to that. So in my point of view, it's not just specific to one category, but we are going to see an emergence of Chinese brands across the board, probably in all different product categories.
And this might not be a China issue, but inflation is high around the world, Daniel. And I wonder, there's been a lot of luxury brands that have increasingly started to raise their prices of their products, and sometimes even more expensive than you're seeing in China than in Europe and the U.S. Is that going to last? Are we continue to see elevated prices, you think? And if I were in the market to buy a Birkin, for example, should I buy it now or buy later?
If.
Yeah. No, that prices increase in luxury is nothing new. If you actually look at the most successful luxury brands, they have been increasing prices almost continuously over the last two decades. You mentioned the Birkin bag. I think this is one of maybe the most famous product in there, where you have price increases that are close to double digit, almost like you can almost see it like a Swiss watch ticking once or twice a year, a price increase. But this also depends on how much value the brands can create. So to me, the key question is not will prices increase more and more. The more fundamental questions that luxury brands have to answer is how much value are they actually creating? Because the price that they can charge, of course, is always a reflection of the value. And if they cannot continue increasing the value proposition towards their clients, then their ability to price is going to decrease quite dramatically. And I see this is to me where there's a quite interesting kind of development between the best brands in the world, which have enormous pricing power because they create enormous value. And then you look at the brands like number 20 to number 100, where a lot of brands actually are struggling quite a bit because they over-relied on price increases and did not manage to create enough value for their audiences.
So, Daniel, it's value which is honest, as you put it, or perceived, arguably, too. So give us an idea of some of the domestic Chinese luxury brands and whether they can build that same sort of value proposition. Which ones are they? And would they then have the same price inelasticity as some of these developed country luxury goods?
Yeah, Let me go back to, for example, give you some examples in automotive, because I think here you can really see how important it is to be very close to the cultural discourse and to cultural expectations. So with the Chinese electric car brands, you see two things. A much bigger focus on entertainment within the car. This means from dashboards to the entire user interface, where probably arguably now some of the Chinese brands have some of the best user interfaces in the world. And where the Western brands have a hard time to compete. And then there's, it's almost like a little bit now, in the meantime, the famous thing about in-car karaoke. If you ask a lot of Western managers, they cannot understand why there is a demand for in-car karaoke. And maybe they think this is just something fancy or not needed. But if you have a generation that likes to sing in a car, that see a function like this as something almost essential, it automatically drives preferences. Another interesting cultural thing is the use of cars less and less for driving purposes only, but also in a lot of cities in China as a bit of a pod for napping during lunchtime. And so now having a functionality where you can, via an app, change the temperature in the car, already pre-condition the car, already put music in, so that if you take a short nap during lunchtime, you have kind of your safety pod there. These are things that traditionally companies would have underestimated, but now become mission critical in terms of driving preferences.